Hey guys, welcome to lecture for this week. So I've noticed that not everyone is watching the lectures, so there may be a little interesting factoid buried in the lecture that you will need to know for the quiz. So let's go ahead and get started. We are moving through chapter 13. All right, this is something that you definitely need to write down. The Democrat Party was split in the election of 1860 into Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. This was the reason that Lincoln, a Republican, was able to win the election of 1860. The Republican Party was relatively new at this point in time. It had reemerged, and so the fact that the Democrat Party was split led it to Abraham Lincoln being able to win. All right, so we need to talk a little bit about the election of 1860. We're going to define a word, and then we're going to talk about the different candidates. You need to know the names of the people who ran for the election of 1860. But first, we need to talk about the fire eaters. So fire eaters are a group of radical Southerners who threatened secession if the Republicans won the presidency. Make sure you write this definition down. So fire eaters, radical Southerners who threatened secession if the Republicans won. Fire eaters, radical Democrat Southerners who threatened secession. So this is a group of people who are radical. I want you guys to think about the fact, does radicalism really help people? Think about all the people who we had talked about in previous sections who compromised, people like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and people who worked to keep the Union together. And then now we're coming into a completely new period in American history where radicalism divides. So keep that in mind. All right, so we have several different candidates running for president in 1860. First, we're going to talk about the Northern Democrats, and their candidate was Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas said that he would adhere to the Supreme Court decisions regarding the territories and slavery and the powers of Congress. He also supported government aid for the construction of a transcontinental railroad. You're going to see like everybody wants the transcontinental railroad, basically meaning a railroad running from the east coast of the United States all the way to the west coast, connecting the country, making Manifest Destiny even more of a reality. So, Northern Democrat candidate, Stephen Douglas. Oh, and this is totally random. He favored the acquisition of Cuba as part of the United States of America. All right, next, the Southern Democrats chose John C. Breckinridge as their candidate. He called for protection of slavery in the territories, very similar to what Stephen Douglas had done. He also supported the acquisition of Cuba and the construction of a transcontinental railroad. So there's really not a huge difference between John C. Breckinridge and Stephen Douglas. All right, now we come to the Republican Party, and they chose Abraham Lincoln as their presidential candidate. Abraham Lincoln opposed the extension of slavery into the territories, but he promised that he wouldn't mess with slavery in states where slavery already existed. He denounced the lawless invasion by armed force of any state or territory, basically saying he didn't want to start a war. He didn't want to invade the South for any reason. And he also supported the building of a transcontinental railroad. There was one other political party that was happening during this time period. Oh, and he's a Republican, so he liked the protective tariff. There's one other candidate that was running for president at this time, and that is the Constitutional Unionist Party, and their candidate was John Bell. And as the name implies, they desired national unity. So here's the Electoral College map, and as you can see, the states were pretty much divided from the Democrats and the Republicans between the North and the South. So Abraham Lincoln was in red and he won all the northern states. John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat candidate, won all the southern states. John Bell, the Constitutional Union candidate, he won the border states. Keep that in mind because we'll be talking about border states as we move through this lecture. And then Stephen Douglas won a whopping 1 state, not even the state that he was from, because actually Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln were from Illinois, and Abraham Lincoln won Illinois. All right, so Abraham Lincoln winning led to the secession of southern states. Remember, the fire eaters had said, if a Republican candidate wins the election of 1860, we're going to secede. And that's exactly what happened. South Carolina was the first state to secede. Remember the nullification, the ordinance of nullification and the nullifying the tariffs? Who created that? South Carolina. So here they are. They're the first state to secede. This was before President Lincoln actually took office. Remember, elections happen in November, but the new president doesn't come into office until the next year, 1861. So the current president, James Buchanan, did nothing when South Carolina seceded. And as a result, several other states followed South Carolina. So make sure you know these names. You're going to need to know all of the names of the states that seceded. So we have South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed South Carolina's example and seceded before the end of 1860. On February 1st, the seceding states joined together to create the Confederate States of America, also known as the CSA. So if I talk about the CSA, that's what I'm referring to, the Confederate States of America. And they created a constitution that was similar to the United States Constitution, but they created a confederacy, meaning that the states were more powerful than the federal government. Confederacy is a loose association of states, and so that's what was created with the Confederate States of America. The leaders were, who you need to know, Jefferson Davis was elected as the president of the Confederacy. Make sure you know that because he is going to be the president for the Confederacy throughout the Civil War. So Jefferson Davis was the president, and Alexander Stephens was selected as the vice president. Write this down. Both were chosen because they were moderates, and the CSA hoped to draw other states to join them. Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stevenson were not fire eaters. Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens were moderates. They were chosen because they were moderates. All right, so here's a look at the map. The light gray states are the group that seceded right before or around the time of the creation of the Constitution and all of that. Then the darker gray states are ones that secede later on after Fort Sumter is attacked. So we're going to move into talking about Fort Sumter next. These dark blue states, they're going to be significant because they're going to be border states, and we'll talk about those in a second. And the lighter blue states are all of the Union states that just remained loyal to the Union throughout the Civil War. All right, so here we go. The South believed that since it had entered the Union voluntarily, it could also leave the Union voluntarily. This is very, very important. Make sure you write this down. The South felt like it had entered voluntarily, so it could leave voluntarily. Bottom line for the Civil War, write this down also. The central issue of the war was over a state's right to secede from the Union. Lots of people will tell you that the Civil War was fought over slavery. Actually, it wasn't. The reason the fighting started to begin the United States Civil War was because South Carolina and a whole bunch of other states had said, peace out, we're leaving the Union. They were trying to secede or leave the Union. That's why Abraham Lincoln sent troops down in the first place. So the South believed it had entered voluntarily, it could leave voluntarily. The bottom line issue of the Civil War was, do states have the right to secede? Make sure you write these two things down. Very important. All right. The South had seized all federal properties within its borders except for Fort Sumter, which is in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, and Fort Pickens, which is off the coast, or well, it was, it's not there anymore, off the coast of Pensacola, Florida. So all of the federal property within the southern states had been seized except for these two locations, Fort Sumter and Pensacola. All right, so now we're moving into the firing on Fort Sumter. First thing you need to know is that neither President Abraham Lincoln nor President Jefferson Davis wanted war, but it ultimately ended up happening. So each side's view on Fort Sumter was the South looked at it as a foreign base within our land, and the North felt like if we withdraw from Fort Sumter, then we're saying that rebellion is okay. So both sides had a view on Fort Sumter. So President Lincoln decided to resupply Fort Sumter, and he sent down a ship with supplies. Jefferson Davis said that under no circumstances was the fort to be resupplied. Jefferson Davis said under no circumstances was the fort to be resupplied. Jefferson Davis, no circumstances should the fort be resupplied. But remember, neither president actually wanted war. All right, so then the ship, the Star of the West, came down to resupply the Union soldiers at Fort Sumter, and when the ship entered Charleston Harbor, the Confederates all around Charleston Harbor started bombarding the fort. The Union ended up surrendering after 40 hours of bombardment. So, random interesting little piece of factoids about Miss Peralta. In 2005, I actually got to visit Fort Sumter. 2005, I visited Fort Sumter. You might want to write that down. 2005, I visited Fort Sumter. All right, so after Fort Sumter, the states of the upper South, so those dark gray states that we saw on the map, they ended up seceding. So we have Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee all voted to secede right after after the firing on Fort Sumter. Write this down. Virginia was a state that was literally torn apart by the Civil War. Virginia was literally split by the Civil War. Virginia was torn apart by the Civil War. All right, so here's a look at our map again. Again, the dark gray states are the ones that we just mentioned seceded, except for the western part of Virginia, which became the state of West Virginia. And so now we're going to move into talking about these border states, these dark gray states, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. All right, so after the Battle of Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteer soldiers. When President Lincoln called for these, that is when the the more northern southern states ended up seceding. But then we need to talk about these border states. So first we have Kentucky. Kentucky was persuaded by Lincoln to declare neutrality, but to remain loyal to the Union. So theoretically, no soldiers from Kentucky no men from Kentucky would be forced to join the Union, and no men from Kentucky should have gone to join the Confederacy. Whether that happened or not, we'll just leave it there. So the state was to remain loyal to the Union. Next, we have Missouri. In Missouri, Federal troops were sent to make it so that the state could not vote on secession. So Missouri wasn't allowed to choose. The soldiers went in and they were forced to stay as part of the Union. Maryland is a very interesting situation. Maryland, martial law was declared, which means the military is in control of government. We have to think about the unique situation of Washington, D.C. and the state of Maryland. Washington, D.C. is surrounded on one side by Virginia and the other side by Maryland. So if Maryland had been able to secede, that means that Washington, D.C. would have been in the middle of enemy territory. So you can see why President Abraham Lincoln did not allow Maryland to even think about seceding. All right, last couple of slides, we're going to go through the reasons that the North had to hope that they would win and the reasons that the South had to hope that they would win. Make sure you write these down, so if you need to pause at the end of the slide, you can. So first of all, the North had hope because of its industrial capacity. They had tons of factories, so they could manufacture the things that they needed for war, like guns and cannons and make boats and things like that. So that was a thing that the North believed would help them. They produced more wealth. The people in the North were wealthier because of the factories than the people in the South. There were more wealthy people living in the North. The population in the North was large already, and it was growing. And part of the reason that it was growing because of people immigrating into the North. They also had a larger navy. So those were the reasons why the North should have felt confident in winning the Civil War. Second, South. They also had reasons to believe that they could win the Civil War. First is they were on the defense. They were defending their nation. They weren't trying to defeat the North. They were just trying to keep the North out and defend themselves. And as we move into the next chapter where we learn about the actual Civil War, the South did well as long as they were on defense. When they went on offense is when they struggled. They were defending their homes and their way of life. Again, defense. They actually thought that they would get foreign help. The Southerners believed that because their way of life was very similar to the British, that England would end up joining them and helping them out. It didn't happen. All right, there's two more reasons on the next slide, so if you need to pause here before you go on to the next slide, do that. Last two reasons that the South believed that they would have success. They had a long coastline that would be difficult to blockade. So although the North had a stronger navy, the South had a huge coastline with lots of really good harbors, which would make it really difficult to stop shipping from coming in and out of the South. And last, they honestly believed that they had better troops and better officers. They might have been right about the officers, which we'll see as we move into the next chapter. All right, that's all for lecture for this week. Good luck on your quiz.